Thank you to everybody for coming out and joining us for this program tonight as part of our first ever Winter Bird Fest here at Fernald Preserve. My name is Stephanie Peg and I'm the Visitor Center Coordinator. So if you're ever back to visit us in person at the preserve, please come say hi to me at the front desk and let me know what you're seeing out there. I wanted to give a brief introduction for our program tonight. And then at the end here, I'll let you know as a little reminder what else we have going on. We still have 2 days of programming here as part of Winter Bird Fest. Our presentation tonight comes from the Owl Research Institute, which is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to owl and wildlife research, conservation, and education. They conduct long-term research on owls, their prey species, and their relationship to the habitat in which they live. They use that data to help maintain viable populations. And the specific presenter coming to us from the Owl Research Institute is Beth Mendelsohn. She is a research biologist who has a long volunteer history with ORI and officially joined the team in 2019. She is a lifelong naturalist and is passionate about all raptors and their conservation. Her research focused primarily on North American owls has afforded her the opportunity to travel and work throughout Western Montana, Alaska, and Wyoming. She shares her passion for field biology, natural history, and long-term research through public speaking, scientific papers, and bringing the public into the field to observe research in action. And we're very grateful to ORI and to Beth for joining us and being part of our first Winter Bird Fest at Fernald Preserve. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Beth and ORI. Thank you for being here, Beth. Virtually.
Thank you so much for the intro. And I did not know that it was the first Winter Bird Fest, so that's really exciting. I'm happy to be part of it, and it's nice to see everybody here with some interest in owls, and hopefully we'll be able to share some really cool information with you tonight. That was a great intro, so thank you. My name is Beth Mendelsohn. I'm a researcher at the Owl Research Institute, and I've been studying owls for about 11 years. Tonight I'm going to talk about short-eared owls, which I've been studying for about 5 years. And one of the things that makes ORI's research really unique is that we spend a lot of time in the field for all of our studies. So a lot of what I do is going out in the field and collecting data and observations on wild owls, and we do that year-round for a lot of our projects. And long-term, meaning that we don't start a research project unless we intend to run it for at least 10 years. And most of our projects are actually 30 plus years. So they've been going on for quite some time. So we are a very small nonprofit organization, but we do have a global presence, and we have research projects on most of North America's owl species. And our founder, Denver Holt, he's one of the leading owl experts in the world. So I invite you to please check out our website, owlresearchinstitute.org, or if you just search owl research, we'll come up, and there's lots of great information on there about more of our research projects, some owl ID guides, all about us. And you can sign up for our yearly newsletter, The Roost, which you can get in the mail or digitally. And we only send that out once a year. It's really fun. It has a lot of great photos in it, and we'll send out an email to you maybe every couple months, so you won't get a whole lot of spam mail from us. And we also have a store, great photos, and you can make a donation on our website. So fun resource to check out. All right, so today I'm going to talk about the short-eared owl and some of the research and what I've learned about short-eared owls in Montana specifically, and that will apply also to some of your owls over there in Ohio. Let's start with a few basic facts about the short-eared owl. One's pictured right here. They're a medium-sized owl, which means they're 1 pound or less and just over a foot tall when they're standing up. So you can see that owl in the photo is perched on a mullein. They can use just really light perches like that, different types of plants or fence posts to perch. They do have a rather large wingspan, about 3.5 feet wingspan, which allows them to fly with a lot of maneuverability, and a round facial disc, pretty distinct facial disc with that forward-facing eyes. And the reason why they're called the short-eared owl is because they actually do have short ear tufts, And we're going to look a little more closely at those. This picture just shows you that round facial disc with the ear tufts that are not erect. And some people think that those are actually ears and have something to do with hearing, but they really don't. They're just feathers. Here's another look as the owl is sort of starting to put those ear tufts up. And the feathers of the ear tufts mostly serve for camouflage, maybe communication, but most of the sound is funneled into the owl's facial disc and goes into the actual ear, which you can see pictured here on the side of the owl's head. It's really just a slit in their head, and all of the ear mechanisms are inside there behind the feathers. And these tufts up here are the ear tufts. There's another view from behind, and that's about the extent of the short-eared owl's ear tufts. It's about as far as they'll go up. So that's what they look like. And so sometimes they might be confused with the long-eared owl, which is a closely related owl that does overlap a little bit in habitat and range, but the long-eared owl has longer ear tufts. So like I mentioned, the facial disc can funnel sound, and the ear tufts can stand up or be put down when the owl chooses. And the owls are actually able to move their feathers around quite a bit on their face for different purposes, for camouflage, for directing sound. And so I want you to take a look at this video and watch the owl's face. And what's going to happen that you won't see off camera is that an eagle flies over the owl. And so the owl wants to make sure the eagle doesn't see it. And I'll let that play again in case you missed it, where the owl pulls into this concealment posture so they can move their feathers around and really blend in with the surroundings. Another really cool thing about short-eared owls that's pretty distinctive is how they fly. And they're often seen at dawn and dusk. Extra points if you can tell me in the chat what the word for an animal that's active at dawn and dusk is. But the short-eared owls sometimes come out before dark, which is really special and means that we are able to observe them in the wild more readily than some of the other owls that are a little bit more nocturnal. And so to recognize a short-eared owl, you can look for the way that they're flying, which is often described as moth-like or buoyant. Like I said, they have large wings for a fairly light and small body size. And so they're able to do those deep wing beats, not too fast, and fly with a lot of agility and also power. Very graceful. So short-eared owls can be found wherever there's suitable habitat, which is open country habitat, and that can be either grasslands, tundra, wetland, even sagebrush, and agricultural fields and crop fields as well. And what we find is that the vegetation typically needs to be tall enough and dense enough to provide some concealment and cover from the elements, but not too much so that it would be difficult to hunt the small mammals that they hunt that are on the ground. So really good habitats would be large swaths of grassland for the short-eared owl. And something kind of cool about short-eared owls is that in the winter, they roost communally. And communally just means more than two or more. So they'll roost or sleep basically during the daytime in groups. And I've heard that there are owls over at your preserve there in Ohio, short-eared owls. I don't know how many there are, but in the winter, often there will be groups of more than one if it's really prime habitat and there's enough food. And so they are going to be roosting communally, and they're going to be on the ground, which is fairly unique in the owl world. This one here in the photo is probably not roosting. It probably just landed there. Typically when they're roosting, they're a little bit more concealed. And so one of the things that we do at ORI is we study the communal ground roosts here in Southwest Montana. in the winter. And we walk transects to find all the owls in a few different areas. And then when we find them, we measure the roosts and we look and see how many owls there were. We count them, we document where they are, and we collect evidence and measure the grasses, species, height, snow cover, things like that. So we're starting to learn a little bit about what their habitat preferences are and what specific areas they use, what characteristics they look for in a roosting site. And these photos show roost sites up close. Often we're finding them where there's a little bit denser, taller clump of grass that provides some shade from the elements, keeps snow off. And sometimes there's even almost this umbrella of grass over their head that they'll just tuck into there. And so they can have camouflage and they can also just be protected from the elements. But we'll also find them, especially on more sunny days, more mild days, really out in the open, just kind of on the ground in a group, a little bit hidden, but not necessarily hiding underneath anything. So if you're ever out there, sounds like somebody said in the chat, you guys have at least 8 in the air. So it sounds like you may have some communal roosts out there, and you might find evidence like this, which would be pellets. There's a pellet there, and owls eat, and then anything they can't digest, they basically barf it back up, and that's a pellet. And whitewash here and here, which is basically just owl poop that comes out. And for owls, it's sort of a buffy color. It's not a bright white like some of the other birds. And then you'll often find feathers in the roost. During the winter, they'll just be these body contour feathers that are kind of downy in the roost. And so a lot of times you might come across a roost with no owl in it because they do move their roosts around. And you can recognize it with some of those 3 key pieces of evidence that are in the roost. And Emma, thank you. Crepuscular is when they're active at dawn and dusk. So good job. Here's some of the data from the last 4 winters where I've done these short-eared owl roost searches. And you can see here that there's a huge variation in how many owls we see at each time. And we're lucky here in the area we are in the Mission Valley of Western Montana. There's pretty much short-eared owls every year, all year. But the numbers vary a lot. So in some of the higher years, we're finding 100 to 150 owls per square kilometer, and roost sizes of up to 80 birds in a single roost. Whereas in lower years, we might only find 2 to 4 owls in that same area. So there can be a lot of variation in what we find, and there can also be variation between the areas. And I've used cameras a few times to monitor some of these roosts to just look and see, okay, what are they doing? What kind of behavior? How many owls are using the roost? When are they coming and going? And so we've gotten to see some really neat footage. I'm going to show you a little bit of that. Here's 2 owls in a roost. You can see all the whitewash and pellets there. And this roost was used for, I think, about a week or so by a few different owls. And what they do in the winter, they're not breeding in the winter, so they're just feeding and they're socializing. And we see a lot of different types of social behaviors that we're not really fully able to interpret, but we definitely see antagonistic behaviors, bonding behaviors like allopreening, things like that. And all the owls in the roost seem to be really hyper aware of each other. They'll watch each other flying in and out, and they seem to be keeping tabs on whatever's going on. So here's a roost that was on the edge of a canal because there was a lot of snow. And so when there's a lot of snow on the ground, they like to find areas that are a little more sheltered where they can get out of the snow. This owl here was not going to share its prime spot there out of the snow. Here an owl kind of flies over and it's going to land behind that group of 4. What the hell? So that's been really neat just to look into the roost, see what are they doing, because really it's almost impossible to actually watch a roost without a camera, because if you get close enough, the owls tend to flush. Plus, a lot of the time it would be dark or dusk where it's tough to see. Okay, so why do we see these huge fluctuations in numbers from year to year and area to area? Well, that's because of voles. Voles are the main food source that short-eared owls are eating. In Montana, that would be meadow voles and montane voles. In Ohio, where most of you may be, is likely the meadow vole would be the main food source, I believe. And vole populations naturally boom and crash depending on environmental factors, food, a lot of different things that aren't necessarily easy to predict. And so when the owls have a high population of voles, there's going to be a lot of owls in the area. But when there's not a lot of voles available in an area, where do the owls go? Do they starve to death? What happens? And so if we look at the range map for short-eared owls in North America, you can see that, like a lot of birds, they have a more northern breeding range and a more southern non-breeding or wintering range in orange, and then there's some overlap where they are breeding and also wintering. However, in short-eared owls, we describe their movement strategy from season to season as nomadism. And that means they're really not fully resident, they're not fully migrant, but they make less predictable, still often long distance movements within their range in search of resources. So some may do a more typical migration where they're going from Canada, for example, down into Mexico, but they might not do that same movement every year. And they may move to different areas in different years. And even within the same season, short-eared owls have been known to move long distances just between different areas. For example, transmitters have been used a few times on short-eared owls, and there was one that was breeding in Wyoming somewhere around here 1 year, and then the next summer it was breeding all the way over in northern Oregon. And so that one chose not to return to the same breeding area, but to move to a new area. And same thing in the winter, they can make movements up to, hundreds and hundreds of miles between winters and within a winter. And I think some of the longest distances that are recorded for short-eared owls between seasons was about 7,000 kilometers. So really long distance movements. And they're doing that to find prey. So it allows them to be able to move to different areas that have good resources. So they're not stuck in one spot if there's not enough food to sustain them for the winter. Because over the winter, they really need to use that time to bulk up, prepare for the breeding season. Maybe the females are in lower body condition after breeding. And for the winter, they'll go somewhere where they can find higher prey populations. In Ohio, the short-eared owl has been documented breeding in a few of these counties here. The light purple ones have documented breeding records of short-eared owls, but mostly you're at the very southern extent of their breeding range, and they are wintering most often in Ohio. And so that's usually going to be from maybe October through March, something like that. Okay, so we've learned about what the owls are doing in the winter. And in the winter, they're roosting communally. They're making these social interactions, social bonds. They may be pairing up for the breeding season. They're feeding on voles, and they're moving around the landscape. And during the migration season, they shift farther north for the summer. Some of them may stay in the same regions, and some may go farther north. They can actually breed even on the tundra, in the Arctic, and in some of the more northern climates as well. And the breeding season typically starts in March, and it's a long breeding season. It goes through July here in Montana. Because what we see is sometimes early breeding in March, and then they may nest multiple times, and that can last all the way through July. And that kind of extended breeding period gives them the chance to nest multiple times. Some short-eared owls may nest in the same summer in one location successfully and then go to another location and nest again. And if you've seen short-eared owls in the spring, anywhere that they're setting up for breeding, you may have been lucky enough to see their courtship displays. And so what happens is the males need to secure a nesting territory and a mate. And so they have an elaborate flight display in order to do this. What they'll do is they'll fly around. Sometimes they'll get really high, up to 1,000 feet up in the air. And then they'll do a series of medium to deep hoots, like and then they dive down really fast and they put their wings under them and they beat their wings together and it makes a clapping sound in the air. So they'll do this all the way up from 1,000 feet all the way down to close to the ground. And they tend to do that where there's females they're displaying to. So the female may be on the ground or perched on a low perch or something. And then they'll also do it while there's other males around to kind of compete with the other males and determine where their breeding territory is going to be. And we don't really know a lot about what like mate choice looks like. Do the females choose the males or how that works? But it's pretty unique in the owl world that we're able to see this mating display because it often happens right before dusk, maybe in the 90 minutes before it gets dark. And then we'll even see it throughout the day. We'll see it starting in March all the way through the end of June sometimes, because like I mentioned, sometimes the owls are going to re-nest. And when they do that, they'll start their displays again. And the males will form new bonds and defend the territories. Okay, so let's take a look at what some of those flight displays look like, and hopefully you'll be able to hear if you listen really closely. I have a recording of the hoots and then the wing clapping noise. There's a slow-mo. I'm going to do that one more time. Sounds like a monkey. Okay. And the other call that you'll hear from a short-eared owl is a barking call. That's kind of an alarm call, and it sounds a little bit like a dog barking. And they also have a hissing food begging call that you really don't hear too often. But if you are out in somewhere they're going to breed in the spring and you hear this, just sometimes they're hard to see. Look around, they might be really high up in the air, and eventually you'll get eyes on one of these displays. Okay, this map is just one area where we do our research here in Southwest Montana, and the dots are color-coded by year. So let's just look at the red dots here for a second. Those are all the nests that we found in this area last spring. I think it was 17 nests in total. And you can kind of see that they're sort of spread out, but some of the nests are as close as 175 yards from one another. The ones that look like they're almost on top of each other, like here, are where we think it was the same owl that the nest failed and then they re-nested. But we don't have DNA results yet to prove that. But these nests didn't overlap in time. They just overlapped in space. So one failed and then the next initiated. But a lot of these nests were going concurrently. And so this was a pretty high year for nests, the red dots last year. But you can kind of see even over the years, this is starting in 2015, they tend to choose the same areas to come back to and nest. And so we're looking into the really habitat characteristics specifically in those areas, like what makes those areas stand out? Why are they choosing those specific areas like within this region that to us might all kind of look like, okay, this is a grassland and a wetland, and what's the difference? What are they looking for? And so far what we're finding is that they're like grass that's going to be just slightly taller than the surrounding grasses and over 12 inches. Typically, the bunch grasses seem to be preferred, although we'll find them in all sorts of different vegetation, whether it's native, non-native, even weeds sometimes are just fine. And that they like a little bit of elevation, but not to be on a prominent ridge or anything like that. Okay, so remember they roost on the ground in the winter, and they also nest on the ground in the summer. They've evolved with this open country, grassland type habitat. There's not trees, there's not perches, so this is what they do. If you can see here closely in this picture, there is a female short-eared owl glaring back at the photographer there, and she's on her nest. So pretty hard to see, pretty camouflaged in the grass. So what happens after that courtship display we watched? The females will make a little nest. They might scratch out the dirt a little bit and then line it with some of the surrounding grasses just to make a small nest. They're really one of the only owls that you could say sort of builds a nest, although it's not really a very fancy structure. And then she'll lay her eggs, and they'll lay eggs one at a time, about a day apart, maybe a little bit more, and anywhere from 4 to 12 eggs. In our area, I would say the most common numbers we see are 7 or 8 eggs. And then the eggs are going to hatch one at a time, typically in the order in which they are laid. So you'll see something like this, where we have a chick that's maybe 2 days old, one that's 3 days old, and we have here an egg that's hatching, almost fully hatched. And this one just has one little pip in the shell where that chick is going to come out. Here's a little bit later where you have a little bit older chick and younger ones, and they grow really fast. They have very fast growth rates. And so this larger chick here is only a couple days older than these smaller ones, but they gain a lot of weight over the first couple weeks of their lives. And then as that progresses, you've got all the chicks hatched here. This one looks like it just hatched. It's just maybe a day old, all the way up until this one is probably like 10 or 12 days old in the nest. And so they have this strategy where they're staggered in age. We call it asynchronous hatching, so that it can increase the chances that some of them will survive. They'll stay in the nest as nestlings only for about 15 days or so, a little over 2 weeks. They cannot fly yet. And what they do is the oldest one will go first, and it'll just walk out of the nest, and it'll hide somewhere away from the nest in the grass. And so they'll all be spread out in the vicinity of the nest, but up to 100 or more yards apart from each other. And so that strategy is going to help survival. If a predator finds the nest, it can easily eat all of the nestlings or eggs in the nest. But if there's some that are already out of the nest, spread out, it might not be able to find all of them. And so a few might survive. And so that's why we think they evolved that strategy. However, when they're out of the nest, but not yet flighted or fledged, they can be super vulnerable. Here, this one on the left has just been out of the nest for about 1 day. So it's still pretty close to the nest, but it found a hiding spot for the day. And then in the evening and the night, it has a vocalization, kind of like this, where it'll beg for food. So the male and sometimes the female will hear it and know where the chick is, and they can bring food directly to the chick. And then this one here on the right side is a little bit older. This one's probably about 5 or 6 weeks old. You can see it's starting to develop its flight feathers. It's got more feathers around its facial disc here, and it's probably almost ready to start flying, taking short little flights. But it takes weeks after they leave the nest for them to actually be able to fly. So they do have this really vulnerable period where they're no longer protected by their mother. They're out of the nest. They can't hunt. They're being fed by the adults, and their mechanism for survival is just to be camouflaged and to hide. And they do have their sharp little talons, which by this age they can do some definite damage, and they'll hiss and they'll snap their bill and things like that to chase away some of the potentially smaller predators. Okay, so unfortunately, we have been documenting really high rates of nest failure, which appeared to be due to predation, with most young not making it to fledging. And here's some pictures of what that would look like. Sometimes when we return to check on a nest, we would just see eaten eggshells, broken eggshells, maybe nothing really left in the nest at all. And that was a little bit concerning because when we've done the same research in the same areas a while back in the late 80s and early 90s, we had higher levels of successful nests. The green line is the nests that were successful versus the total. And then here, since 2014, that green line is way below the red line, and our nest success level was only about 30%. And in some years, you can see none of the nests were successful. And what we want to see with species like this would be that in those big years where we have a lot of nests, that those years are really important. So during those years, some of the young need to survive to breed. And so if those years even are having lower productivity or successful nests, then that could indicate that there might be a problem for the species. So what I wanted to do was figure out what was causing this nest failure. As we already saw, it's not always easy to see into the nest. Most of the time, you can't see into the nest at all. Sometimes you can see with binoculars from just the right angle, but you wouldn't be able to monitor it around the clock. Here's a nest that we checked on with a drone. We'll do that sometimes so we don't disturb the nest. You can fly over it with the drone, and the female doesn't seem to mind. If you can't see her, I'll give you guys a second to try and find the female on her nest in that picture. There she is, looking up. So that's one way to tell that the nest is still active. But what I wanted to do was use cameras to monitor the nest, so we could monitor them around the clock, and we could do it without disturbing them, without having to even go near the nests. That was a little bit difficult of a challenge because the grassland habitat, the wind, the remoteness, getting power, so many different factors that we had to overcome. A lot of troubleshooting over a few years, but we were able to figure out a fairly successful system of cameras to monitor these grassland nests. And on the left here, this is a really tiny spy camera. And we were able to get that camera pretty close to the nests. And then we'd put a second camera at each nest, like something like this one on the right. That was a little bit larger. It would be farther away from the nest to provide a wide angle view. And so that way we could see right into the nest what was happening in case there was a smaller predator, like a weasel or a snake or something like that. But we could also get that wide angle, see owls coming and going, larger mammalian predators, or things like that. And in order to not disturb the nests at all, short-eared owls are pretty sensitive to nest disturbance. So we really have to be careful not to make trails, not to flush them off their nests, not to leave scents, anything like that. So what we did was we set up a solar-powered battery about 200 feet away from the nest with long cables to the camera, so that we set up the camera, placed the battery, and we didn't have to return to the nest. We could go to the camera, check on the footage, make sure the nest was active, make sure the camera was working without ever having to go to the nest. So that was a really neat way to do it once we figured out how to make it possible. And we ended up with just thousands of hours of footage. These were motion activated cameras, but with the wind in the grasslands, there's often just hours and hours of grass waving that you have to sort through. So that was kind of fun. And so over the course of 3 years, the past 3 springs, I was able to put out 29 cameras on nests. And the results from that were able to capture 16 nest failures. 9 of those were caused by predators. 5 were caused by abandonment. So the female left the nest and didn't come back. We don't necessarily know if she died or left because she wasn't getting enough food or disease or something. Usually that's unknown unless we find the owl's carcass. And then we had 2 that were unknown because the cameras weren't working properly during the time that the predation happened. So I'm going to let you guys watch a little bit of the footage that I recorded from a few years on these cameras, just to give you an example of some of the predators that we saw. I just want to give a little bit of a disclaimer here. If you're sensitive to some of nature's maybe more grisly things, you might not want to watch for the next minute or so, but just in case. Okay, so go ahead and type in the chat if you want what you saw as the most common predator in these videos. I'll give people a second to do that in case you want to weigh in. You're lucky because I watched all these videos and just gave you the key parts of some of the videos. But yeah, it looks like we've got a couple people who got it spot on. It was coyotes. 100% of the predators that we captured were coyotes, which is a little bit surprising because we do know there's other predators, ravens we've seen, and skunks, foxes, raccoons that we sort of expected would all play some role in the nest predation. And our sample size is a little bit small. Cameras on 29 nests, only 16 failed, 9 predations. So we're still collecting data on this, but what we've learned is that the coyotes are really the major nest predator in this area. And it could be potentially concerning because we have that high rate of nest failure and because of a few other factors that we know about. For example, while these are great conservation lands, they're really well managed and they're protected, they're also pretty fragmented and they're surrounded by roads, by farms, homes, and developments where trees are planted, there's structures, and all of that can provide cover and for coyotes, ravens, other predators, plus the fragmentation, the breaking up of these large swaths of grasslands that would have historically been present, make it a lot easier for coyotes in particular to just find all the nests. So we've seen them and they'll almost do transects through the areas. When a coyote sees an owl flush off of a nest, they'll go right to that nest because they know what that means. And in these areas, we're also seeing a lot of duck nests, a lot of pheasant nests, some harrier nests, curlews, and they all seem to be suffering from a pretty high level of coyote predation on the nests. And you might have seen in some of these videos as well, a little bit of nest defense. Let me see if I can go back and play. Here, and at the end of this one, an owl's going to swoop in. And usually they'll just swoop and they'll bark. They may hit the coyote once or twice, but the short-eared owl is fairly small and it's not able to chase away a predator as large as a coyote. And so their only defense mechanism against something large like a coyote is their camouflage. And they'll sit on their nests for as long as possible, and the female will flush off at the very last second. That would protect her from getting eaten by the coyote. So her best chance is to sit tight and hope that nothing sees her. Which works really well in a lot of ways. For humans, for example, you can walk right by a short-eared owl nest. You might be within 5 feet of the nest and you won't know it because the female won't flush until you get really close to it. And that varies by owl. There's some variation, but in general, they just sit really tight. That's their best protection. Okay, so one thing we've learned from putting out the cameras is how to recognize some of the clues that are left behind. We're not going to always be able to put cameras on every nest, and so we wanted to learn, okay, what does it look like after a coyote has preyed upon the eggs, or a raven, or if the nest has been successful or abandoned. And so we do definitely have a better idea of what all those things look like. However, here on the left, that egg was eaten by a coyote. In the middle, that nest was also preyed upon by a coyote, but it had all nestlings in the nest, and the coyotes ate them all and didn't leave any evidence behind. And if you found that nest in the field, it might be hard to tell if it was a successful nest where the chicks left or if they didn't make it. And we'll also just find eggshells in the nest a lot of time, just little fragments that don't really give us a whole lot to go on. Occasionally we find fur when the owl makes contact with the coyote with their talons, they might leave behind a little bit of fur. And then from a bird or a raven, which we've seen a few times, not on the cameras, you get these little peck holes in the shells. Okay, so we've definitely learned a lot about the predators that short-eared owls are facing using these cameras. We've also been able to capture a lot of really interesting behaviors, kind of like the winter roosts, things that we just haven't been able to see previously because you just can't see the nests. Maybe you could set up a blind and sit there for days on end, but we don't really have time to do that. And so we were able to record and observe some new things that we really just haven't seen before. Some of them we knew they probably occurred, others were fairly new. This clip is kind of fun. It shows how the owl will respond to a non-predator animal at the nest. So this deer, he finds the nest, sticks his nose in the nest there. And what the female will do is she'll just kind of snap her bill and kind of peck at him to chase the deer away. And so we're going to see how okay, that's a different response. Deer are probably not predators on short-eared owl eggs because the female does not flush off the nest. She's able to just keep the deer away from the nest. And then we had some cameras that we were able to get close enough to the nest to just get a really neat view inside the nest. Here we'll see that when the chicks are small, the female has to shield them with her body. They're not able to thermoregulate until they're about 10 days old. And so she provides all their thermoregulation, protects them from really intense sun or rain. And then she also has to tear up their food into little pieces so that they can swallow it. And so here's a female doing that. She has 8 or 9 little chicks under there. And this nest was actually one that was successful, so it's a happy ending on this one. And then we're able to see kind of when the chicks are big enough, old enough to start eating whole prey. Remember, they leave the nest when they're just over 2 weeks old. And so by then they need to be able to swallow like a whole vole because they're not going to be with their mother much anymore. The male is usually just going to bring them a vole and drop it off, and they need to be able to eat it. So here we'll see one that's not quite old enough yet to be able to swallow up that whole vole. Can't quite do it. That one's maybe 9 days or something, and the female's going to tear up the food and give it to her. We also see them producing pellets. See this little one here? Little owl producing this huge pellet. And then the female keeps the nest sanitary. She'll pick up the pellets and swallow those, and then she'll go cast them away from the nest at a later time to keep the nest bowl clean. And we can see that as their chicks get older, as there's more chicks in the nest, she can't really keep up with all the pellets and the poop, and so it starts to build up in the nest, and that helps us just know how to age the nest. If we come to a nest that's been failed, we can still find that evidence. Okay, it definitely had older chicks in the nest or just eggs, something like that. We've also been able to watch how the chicks depart the nest and see that they'll leave and then they'll come back a few times until eventually they'll leave, and they won't come back. So here's a video where this little guy was the last chick in the nest. The other ones had already all left, and he's kind of starting to get ready to leave. The female was off the nest for a little bit at this time. And so the chick is walking away. And then the male comes in with a vole, which he'll usually give it to the female, but she's not there, so he's not sure what to do. And so now we'll get to see from the other camera that was farther away from the nest, that little chick is running, oh gosh, back to get that vole. And then there he is. But the male's hesitant to give it to him. He usually will give it to the female when she's in the nest. We also were able to see how a lot of the females, when they return to their nest, in order to conceal the location of the nest, they land somewhere else and they walk into the nest. And there was a lot of variation in that, how far away they would land and walk in. Most of them wouldn't land right next to the nest, but a few would. And that was probably just a protection against any predators that might be watching, that can pick up on cues like that to help protect the nest location. So here, over here is a female, and she actually started way back there, and she's returning to her nest, walking in. And there she is. And one thing that we have a lot of data on now that we're still going through is the prey deliveries. So we're learning when they deliver prey, what time of day, how often do the males bring prey, how much prey do they bring, and how that changes as the nest progresses from just being the female on the nest to having more and more mouths to feed. Here's a prey delivery at night. Male comes in, drops off the food, and takes off. That's about the extent of it. Okay, so short-eared owls, like I mentioned, are thought to be on the decline. Many grassland species are experiencing rapid habitat loss, fragmentation of that habitat, deterioration and changes in the quality of that habitat, that can really affect the species that are living there. Further, the ecosystems and predator-prey dynamics in many areas have been altered, like in our area, maybe having an abundance of coyotes with no natural predators for the coyotes, can change the dynamics and the natural checks and balances in that ecosystem. With short-eared owls, they're also prone to vehicle strikes. They like to hang out along roads because there's often fence posts to perch on to hunt from. The juveniles like the banks on the side of the road to provide cover, and then they fly really low, so it's easy for them to collide with vehicles. So we see that as a fairly heavy cause of death for short-eared owls and other owls. Barbed wire entanglement is another one. again, flying low, past fences, they have that long wingspan, and sometimes they don't see the fence and they'll become entangled with it. Plus rodenticide poisoning can be a problem in any area where there's poisoning going on for high rodent populations. Obviously, high rodent populations also attract owls, who can help actually reduce those populations. But if an owl eats a rodent that's been poisoned, then the owl will also be poisoned. And so I believe, and we believe at ORI, that it's really important to learn as much as we can about these species while we still can, and then to share that knowledge with anyone who's interested that can help lead to their conservation. So I think the more we know, the more we're learning about these birds, just helps invoke awe in us and teach us about how these creatures use the landscape, what their behaviors are, what they rely on, and their needs, so that we have that data out there for conservation. And we work pretty closely with land managers in the area to share our data, not only on owls, but on all the species that we find, so that they can be managed for appropriately. A lot of people saying what they can do to help owls. And what, we talked about roads, so driving at night, just try to drive slower and be aware that owls are out hunting along roads at night often, especially when you have the younger birds, which is going to be in the late spring and early summer. Don't use rodenticides. Those can remain in the ecosystem for a while and cause problems for a lot of different species. And then one way that we're hoping people will use our data is to know a little bit more about the timing and the locations of breeding, since breeding is really a key part in the life cycle. It's that time when they are going to produce the next generation. So we definitely need to protect that. And we've learned, for example, that they can breed as early as March and as late as July. And knowing that there can still be unflighted young well into July, can help us know, okay, what is the best way to manage these key areas where owls and young birds are going to be very vulnerable. So here, this photo is kind of neat. It's a male short-eared owl in April, I think, so early spring, when the owls are doing their courtship displays and selecting their nesting sites and territories. And then as part of management, that's pretty common, the area was burned that spring. And so we don't know exactly what happens. Was the owl able to go find an area just across in the other field and nest, or was it too late and all the territories were already occupied and the owl wasn't able to nest that year? We're not really sure. So that's something we're trying to study a little bit more. How do things like burning, haying, mowing, grazing, any herbicide application, how does that affect breeding short-eared owls? So that land managers and agricultural producers can leave some fields uncut or ungrazed and create these safe spaces for owls during the key breeding moments where they can breed and protect some areas. So hopefully you've learned a little bit tonight, maybe a little bit more information about short-eared owls. So you can go out, look for short-eared owls, find short-eared owls on your own, start to notice some of those behaviors that we've talked about. This beautiful field here where we do some of our work, it's one of my favorite places to be in the evening. We get these beautiful sunsets. And if you know what's out there, you can look at it a little bit differently and you'll start to see more wildlife, more owls, and understand why they're there and what they're doing and what their needs are. And remember looking for those pellets, whitewash, and feathers. Owls leave behind a lot of sign. You might hear the hooting or the wing clapping up in the air if it's a short-eared owl. Okay, so the Owl Research Institute, where I work, we are a really small organization. Please go to our website, check out our store. We have some cool stuff. We have the Roost newsletter that you can sign up for. You can follow us on social media if you use that. YouTube, we have a few things there to check out. And we rely solely on donations from private donors to continue our work. And we also partner with explore.org, which is a organization that brings wildlife and animal and nature cameras to their website where anybody can go and watch them. And so we have a few owl and osprey live cams, usually during the spring. We also have a winter cam right now on a long-eared owl roost. Long-eared owls roost communally like short-eared owls, but they roost in trees. And so we'll put a camera up where you can watch them in real time, watch them live. Let me see if I can get that to open for you. Okay, well, anyways, you can go ahead and check out explore.org, and we have our own tab at the top where it says Owl Institute cams. You can click on the long-eared owl cam. Here in Montana, the great horned owl, the ones you see in this photo, they're starting breeding. So any day now, we expect them to lay eggs. And then when that happens, we'll try and set up a nest cam on great horned owls. You can also just go back and watch some of the footage from previous years. They have highlight reels that you can look at, and just if you're interested in more up close looks at these really fascinating behaviors in owls, then you'll get to see some. Okay, I think we have plenty of time for questions, so I'd love to answer any of your questions if you have any. Correct me if I'm wrong, Stephanie. I think you can type your questions in the chat. Is that right?
Yes, you can type your questions in the chat, and I think Francis is keeping an eye on that to make sure people get seen. And I'll mute myself for a second and see if anyone joining us here in person has questions too.
Hi. Do they partner with other researchers that are researching like the coyotes and the snakes and the weasels and other predators to see what their kind of habitats and population sizes are, and how it correlates to the owl population and the successful nests and stuff?
Okay, I'm sorry, I missed the very beginning of the question. Can you just repeat it for me?
Sure, I'll repeat it into the microphone a little bit quicker. I think they were asking if ORI is partnering with or has relationships with any organizations or any other researchers that are maybe researching other types of animals and seeing if there's an overlap. Is that
Yeah, particularly the predator animals and their population.
so maybe if there is a coyote researcher, for instance, or something like that? I think that was their question.
Okay. Yeah, so where we are here, we're on the Flathead Indian Reservation. We work closely with the Tribal Wildlife Department, and a lot of the lands around here are managed and owned by the Montana State and by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so we partner closely with all of those organizations. However, like there's not a ton of wildlife research going on right here in these short-eared owl areas. So no, there isn't much going on with coyote research. Wildlife Services is sometimes present in the area. Does that answer the question?
Well, we're waiting for stuff from chat. I have a question too. So we here at Fernald, we're very lucky. We have the short-eared owls that visit us during the winter. We also have our northern harriers that come and visit us. And we know with the northern harriers, we're lucky because the females and the younger birds have one coloration version, and the adult males have another color version. And some of you may have been lucky enough to see the gray ghost that we have seen the past couple of days. I know he was really active last Saturday. Do we know what our ratios here with the owls might be? Are the females more likely to migrate, like is the case with some species, or is there a mix?
For short-eared owls, I don't think we really know a lot about their movements. There haven't been a whole lot of studies with, like, for example, tracking devices or transmitters on them. it's tough to do with owls. They're tough to capture, and with short-eared owls in particular, the transmitters have been shown to actually be detrimental to their survival sometimes. And so that's a good question. And it is often the case in some other owl species that the males tend to stay closer to the areas where they're breeding so that they can kind of be there first, hold down their territory, things like that. Whether that's the case with short-eared owls, I really don't know. And we can tell the males apart from the females. There's some overlap, so it's not always exact. But the females are a little bit more darker, richer brown in color than the males. If you see them flying from underneath, the females are going to have more buffy tones where the males have a lot more white. Same thing with the facial disc and the tarsus a little bit. So sometimes we can get a good idea, okay, that's a male, that's a female. And we're looking at that a little bit in our winter roost cams, but it's generally not easy to tell on the footage. It's something that you kind of have to be in person to really get a good idea of if it's a male or a female. So a lot really still unknown about the short-eared owl. A lot still to find out. We would love to start a genetics project, and there's actually sort of a worldwide interest in doing that because short-eared owls are distributed across the world. There's 10 recognized subspecies, but with those long distance movements, it seems like they're probably mixing a lot. And so we'd love to just do more genetics, look at those populations, if there are any, and also be able to look more locally. For example, I think I mentioned earlier that we think sometimes the nest fails and they'll go re-nest in the same territory again. But is it the same female? Is it the same male? We'd love to do some more genetics to find out those answers as well.
And then Beth, I don't know if you can see, but there's a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay. Are shorties the only owls that build a nest? Let's just talk about North American owls. And in North America, the snowy owl, you could argue, builds a nest. Again, they'll nest on a mound and they'll create a little bit of a scrape in the ground. So not deep, a little more than the short-eared owl. And then the eggs will pretty much be directly in that ground. So that kind of counts as building the nest. The short-eared owl puts a little bit of grass in the nest, although by the time they're done, it's pretty much just bare ground with all those chicks leaving the nest. Let's see, is that it? Yeah, I would say that those are the only ones. So we have a lot of owls that are cavity nesters. They rely on existing cavities in trees. Those can either be cavities that were excavated by woodpeckers or natural cavities that have just eroded from trees or dead or dying trees typically. And so let's see if I can name them all. That would be the screech owls, the pygmy owl. There's a few different pygmy owls, the saw-whet owls, boreal owls, hawk owls often are using cavities, barred owls often are using cavities. And then we have some species that often use stick nests that are built by other birds. Great horned owls, probably the most common, that'll steal nests from red-tailed hawks or ravens or other raptors that build large stick nests. But they'll also use large cavities in trees or broken top snags. And broken top snags are also pretty important for great gray owls. So yeah, in general, besides the owls that nest on the ground, those existing structures are really important for owls breeding. Oh, and I guess there's the burrowing owl as well. They nest kind of on the ground, but underground, and they rely on existing burrows as well. Okay, next question. How long do they live? We don't have a lot of records. There hasn't been a lot of banding of short-eared owls, and then even when there has, recapture rates are very, very low. For example, in our study area, we've banded a decent amount of females and nestlings, and we've never recaptured one. Occasionally, we'll find one dead like a few weeks later if it's a chick or a young bird that didn't make it, but we don't have any recaptures. So I think the longevity record is 11 or 12 years, something like that. But before that, it was just 4 years. And a lot of researchers describe them and believe them to be a short-lived owl. I don't necessarily know that that's true. I think there's like a lot of other owl species, they probably have very low survival rate in the first year or two of their life, but some are going to make it to breed multiple years. Okay, next question from Gabriella. Do they breed multiple times regularly or mainly when the first clutch fails? Again, I don't know because we only have a few instances where we knew it was the same bird, not in my study, in other studies where the bird might have had a transmitter and it bred somewhere and then bred somewhere else in the same season. But what we notice is that when nests fail here, we often find another nest that the timing is just right. So if the female went a couple days later and laid eggs in that nest, it's really close, like in the same territory as the other nest. So we think that they will re-nest when the nests fail. We just need genetic analysis to prove that that's true. And then if the clutch doesn't fail, we also think that sometimes they'll re-nest, but again, if they're going to re-nest somewhere else that's hundreds of miles away, we're just not going to know it. Okay, the next question is, do they have any smell when they are born? That's an interesting question. I don't know. I'm guessing the question is sort of wondering, like, can predators maybe smell the newly hatched chicks? And it's possible they come out of the egg and they're a little bit damp, but the female when they're that little, she protects them. She covers them up almost entirely for the first week of their life. And so I think that would mask most of the smell. I haven't noticed the smell personally, but obviously I'm not a coyote or a dog or anything like that. So when we captured coyotes finding the nests on video, it didn't look like they were following a trail or a scent. In some cases, we think they maybe heard chicks. The chicks will make a chittering noise sometimes. Or if they were close enough and the female flushed off, they knew that clue, and then they would search the area and find the nest. Okay, another question. Do we ban the owls? Yes, we do. While I was doing this camera work, I mostly stopped banning them because I wanted to be able to test how much of a factor the researcher nest disturbance was. And so on all the nests where I put out cameras, we put out the camera and then we did not go back to the nest. So we didn't want to be part of the picture. And that way I could look and see, okay, are the cameras contributing to nest failure? And the results showed that no, we actually had lower rates of failure on the nest with cameras than the nest without. And so the nests in the past few years that we didn't put cameras on, we tried to check them without flushing the female, which sometimes is impossible, but we can use the drone, we can use a scope, binoculars from far away, just to get a look and see if that nest is still active, sometimes see a prey delivery in the evening. So we've sort of scaled back the banding for now, but we'll likely continue that in the future. I don't see any more questions, but I'm happy to take any more if there are any.
Beth, I don't see any more on the chat. Stephanie, any more out of the resource room?
No more here.
Oh, one more in the chat. Can I come and volunteer?
Oh, can you come and volunteer? We actually do have volunteer opportunities with short-eared owls. We were out today when we're searching for the winter roosts. I have a crew of volunteers walking transects with me so that we can cover a lot of ground. And so we will potentially have a couple more of those in March, but only do that in the winter. So if volunteering is something that you're interested to do, you can check out our website. We have a form there that you can fill out on volunteering and see what opportunities are available. Okay, one more question. Are the owls hard to catch? Yes and no. The females, while they're nesting, are pretty easy to catch because, like I said, they tend to just sit on their nest, sit tight. So we have a few methods using nets where we can capture them on their nests. But being open country species, they are pretty difficult to catch. You can't just like set up a mist net in the middle of a field and hope one flies into it. So we're working on actually improving the methods for catching them, seeing if we can make it work a little bit better. Okay. Oh, this is a great question. Is there anything owl watchers should keep in mind for ethical viewing? Yeah, definitely. I think we want people to be able to go out and see owls and really learn to appreciate them. And short-eared owls in particular can be very sensitive. I think most folks are able to observe them like from roads or observation platforms in places where you're not tromping through their habitat. And I think that's really important. And we're lucky that we can see them often during the day. And so you have that opportunity to do that. But I think in any case, when you're watching an owl, just be mindful of its behavior. If they're looking at you, if they're not hunting, if they're doing any kind of behavior where they're noticing you or doing their concealment posture that we saw, like trying to do the camouflage, that's usually a clue that, okay, I'm probably too close, and you should give them some distance. And just limiting the amount of time, if you want to get some photographs, great. Get your photographs and leave. Spending days and days watching nests or something like that, we've seen it can really have detrimental effects. It may seem like everything's okay, but if you're keeping an owl awake when she needs to be resting or keeping her alert, if you're keeping a male away from delivering prey, the female and the chicks aren't getting enough prey. Predators, ravens can really pick up on humans near roosts, near nests, and they're going to come check it out. So there's some things just to think about that you may not necessarily see, but are happening.
Okay, and I don't see any more questions in the chat.
Okay,
And this has been amazing. Thank you so much.
you're very welcome.
Hey, I have one more question for y'all, just because I've
Okay.
been thinking about
Excellent.
it. Okay. So we here at Fernald get a lot of interactions, and they're really interesting interactions between the harriers and the owls. And we've seen aerial fights, and an owl drop a vole, and then a harrier swoops in, and they're chasing each other and having all kinds of really intense confrontations. Are you seeing any kind of interactions with that in their breeding areas?
Yeah, definitely. That's really common. The harriers and the owls overlap in their habitat. But one is more diurnal and one is more nocturnal, but you have that period, especially dawn and dusk, where harriers can be very active and the owls can be very active too. So that's where we see a lot of interactions. Harriers love to steal food from other birds, so that can occur sometimes too. Harriers can also roost communally in big groups, but we don't often see them in the exact same spot. And for nesting, we've actually noticed that when there's a lot of owls around, there's usually less harriers. So I'm not exactly sure about how the dynamics are going on there, but there may be some avoidance. And harriers will often choose nesting sites that are in a slightly different habitat, even within the same area, more like taller grasses, maybe in reeds, wetland type, whereas the owls are going to prefer slightly more dry, a little bit shorter vegetation.
That is super interesting. Thank you. It's something that we see a lot here. So that's interesting to know they're still interacting in that way in other areas too. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any other questions here either. And I don't want to keep you too much longer. But gosh, this has been so fascinating and such a neat look. I think those of us that either work here or that frequent Fernald, we feel very lucky to get to observe the owls on a pretty regular basis. I get to see them almost every day. And it's been real neat to get some of that additional context, and I've certainly learned a whole lot about. So if we can all kind of give our virtual thank yous to Beth and ORI. Thank you all for joining us. This has been really neat. I
Thank
do
you
want
for hosting.
Thanks. It's been our pleasure. So exciting. Y'all were one of the first people we had in mind when we started planning Winter Bird Fest. Which speaking of, we still do have 2 more days worth of programs. If anybody is game to join us here bright and early at 8 a.m. tomorrow, we are going to have some bird banding happening with Luke, our licensed bander. He's going to be hanging out outside the visitor center here, hoping to band some sparrows if the weather's cooperative. We're also going to be taking a look at some evidence, and I actually have some short-eared owl pellets that we can take a look at tomorrow night. We're going to be doing owl pellets for adults because it's usually the kids that get to play with owl pellets, but I think adults deserve to play with owl pellets too. So I'm going to have those, and we will have a short-eared owl walk tomorrow. We're starting a little later at 6 p.m., hoping to catch some of our other owls present on site too. And then again, on Saturday, we have more programs. We have a morning bird walk with the Audubon Society of Ohio. We have a duck identification workshop. And super exciting, we have Raptor Inc. that will be bringing some live raptors here. And another virtual program, if those of you that might be a little bit further away from Fernald, we have another virtual program, this one, an ornithotherapy presentation with Holly Merker, author of Ornithotherapy and a member of the Mindful Birding Network. And then our last short-eared owl hike of the season on Saturday at 5:15. So I hope you'll all be able to come out and join us. And just a reminder, I know the weather's looking a little bit interesting over the next couple days. We do have a weather line. It's in our brochure. I'm happy to give it to anybody who needs it. If there's any question, we have all of our program and weather updates on that weather line. So I hope you all will be able to, I know I recognize a lot of you from last weekend. I hope you'll join us again for some more exciting programs. And thank you all for being a part of Winter Bird Fest.